Welcome everyone to our SPED NET webinar, A View from the Inside. We're pleased to have you joining us. This is our first webinar of the year. I'm Eve Kessler, co-founder of SPED NET. Ali Sheffers, our tech consultant, is hosting. We're excited to have these three extraordinary individuals here tonight. Michael Gilberg, Robert Tudisco, and Ptahra Jeppe are attorneys with Autism Spectrum Disorder, ADHD, and Dyslexia, who have worked through their challenges and have built amazing careers. They're here to share with us what they've experienced in their educational and professional lives and how they've used their lived experiences to connect with families and to help others. We are recording this webinar. We record all of our webinars and presentations. Then we send out copies by email and post them on our website, spednet.org, and our YouTube channel. If you're familiar with SPEDNet, you know that we have an incredible archive of videos on our website, organized by subject and speaker, for you to rewatch, share with your partner, team, or child. A few ground rules. Because this is an open forum and the presentation is being recorded, we cannot guarantee confidentiality. You may not want to reveal any private information in your questions. If you have questions, please hold them until the end. Then please type them into the Q&A, not the chat, because it's easier for us to keep track of them in the Q&A. Any information provided in the presentation is for general informational purposes only, not intended to be legal or therapeutic advice. Lastly, this webinar is presented in partnership with Wilton Public Schools and the Newtown SPED PTA. Thank you all. We'll turn it over now to Attorney Michael Gilberg.
Thank you for your introduction. I apologize for the darkness where I am. So I guess, do we have the slideshow ready to go?
It should be up if everybody can see it.
I can see it. I don't know if we can, the observers, I guess, see it.
Yep, we're good.
Okay, good. So as Eve said, my name is Michael Gilberg. I'm a special education attorney. I practice in New York and Connecticut. I'm here with Robert Tudisco and Ptahra Jeppe, who are also special ed attorneys. They will talk more about their background, but I guess with that, we'll go to the first slide. Autism, very important word lately. So I grew up with what I would say is undiagnosed Asperger syndrome. I always tell the story. When I was growing up in the 80s and early 90s, people assumed autism was a nonverbal kid sitting in the corner banging his head against the wall, and didn't think that people like myself who were verbal, who were functional, who could be a bit of a mouth off a bit, could be autistic. As I got into the 90s, we got into the 90s, people started expanding the definition, and I was diagnosed with Asperger syndrome, which is a higher functioning form of autism. Now it's all one big spectrum. So next slide. Autism is a neurodevelopmental disability that affects the ability to process information in particular areas, particularly in areas of communication and social interaction. The current rate is 1 in 31. You hear all these numbers about it going up. I don't believe that autism is increasing. I believe our diagnostic criteria is getting better, and people who are being diagnosed now are people who are being diagnosed who wouldn't have been, like myself. I wasn't diagnosed till I was 18. I was just telling the others before we got on. I believe my father's on the spectrum, but he's never been diagnosed, and he's not going to be at 78. So I think it's a better diagnostic criteria. Autism is a spectrum condition, so no two people are alike or will have the same challenges. They always say you've met one autistic, you've met one autistic. Next slide. Autistic people are known for their special interests, and some common that they get very fixated on. I will admit, I had some of these when I was a child. As an adult, I've kind of moved away from the quote fixating on special interests. Common ones are trains, which is unbelievably common. If you watch The Big Bang Theory, Sheldon is almost two on point as an autistic person. Dinosaurs, science fiction, Disney, video games, sports. Now look, there's a lot of what I call Disney adults. That doesn't mean they're autistic, but these are common specials. Some of the less common ones. I had a client one obsessed with toilet bowls. Knew everything about them. Roller coasters, Greek mythology. So they can range from the very common, like I said, trains or dinosaurs, to the very obscure. Next slide. There are three levels of autism the way they do it now. They don't have autism and Asperger's and what used to be called PDD NOS. Now we have level one, which is requiring support, like myself and a lot of people I know. Basically, people who are independent but get through life with some level of support, which all humans do. No human gets through life independently. Level two requires substantial support. Now, the question is what makes it go from some support to substantial? And level three, very substantial. These are going to be your people who could never be independent, who can't really feed themselves or toilet themselves. The question of where line between one and two and three can be a little fuzzy, and I don't think they fully have determined those lines, particularly between one and two. Next slide. There's a lot of controversies within the autism and self-advocate community. There's controversy over ABA, which is applied behavior analysis, and the concept of making people quote unquote normal versus letting them live in the world as they are. And as I always explain it, certain behaviors might be unusual, but they're not harming anyone, so who cares? But certain behaviors, like kids running in the street, have to be addressed because there's no way you can safely say, oh, he's just autistic, let him run in the street. There's controversy within the community. On the one end, you have the Autistic Self Advocacy Network, which is the very radical people in the community, versus Autism Speaks, which a lot of self advocates don't like. I'm involved with the Autism Society of America, which is more in the middle because there's this self advocate, what I would call a self advocate versus parent struggle. There's been fights over things like the puzzle piece versus the infinity symbol, standing out versus blending in. It's a whole neurodiversity movement, and the question is, who gets to determine what other people? Who gets to determine what's right for someone else? And then there's other diversities. There's the intersection of autism with race, gender, sexual orientation. For some reason, and I don't know why, autism is very common with people who are either bisexual, gay, or have gender identity challenges. As a straight male who's autistic, I'm very unusual in that sense. I was once at a meeting where I was the only person who was straight and didn't have a gender identity issue. So it's something that's an emerging area. Next slide. Recent controversies, as I'm sure you've all heard, on vaccines and Tylenol, with everything going on with this. First, they would say there is no credible evidence exists tying the autism to MMR vaccines or other vaccines. A lot of this is just noise. It's not true. No evidence exists tying autism to Tylenol usage. One thing people don't seem to be realizing is Tylenol was invented in 1950 something. The first case of autism was diagnosed in the 40s, and in fact, Hans Asperger, who Asperger's was named for, was diagnosing kids in Germany in the 1930s. So autism was being diagnosed before Tylenol existed. So that kind of to me answers the question. Most of the autism vaccine information the link has come from a study by I almost said former British. He's still British, but he's not a doctor anymore. A British former doctor, Andrew Wakefield, who had falsified his data and retracted his study, and he has caused a lot of the trouble, and he has been completely discredited as a scientist, and has lost his medical license, and has admitted he made the data up. Next slide. I thought this was a great demonstration of some of the challenges autistic people face with the different, interoception, proprioception, exteroception, stimming, just all the different things. It's a great, to me, example of the challenges with autism and how they all fit together. Next slide. In summary, people with autism don't need to be fixed. They just need to be taught to live in this world. Sometimes it's not easy for anyone. People with autism often have high anxiety, obsessive or repetitive thoughts, and social isolation leading to depression. There's a reason why suicide is a leading cause of death among autistic people without intellectual disabilities. Among those with intellectual disabilities, it's epilepsy. And we don't know why, but there's a high rate of people on the spectrum with intellectual disabilities who also have epilepsy. And I'm not sure what the reason is for that. That's a medical question that I don't think they've answered. So I think it's Robert's turn. Next.
Okay, thank you, Michael. One thing I wanted to say before we get started was that while the three of us are talking about, the disabilities that impact us directly, there's an awful lot of overlap between them. There are a lot of kids that I represent with ADHD that are also on the spectrum or have learning disabilities. So what that really does is kind of magnify the symptoms or what presents with each, and also presents a more complicated way to address those challenges that those kids face. And the other thing I wanted to say is that we're kind of talking about the disabilities themselves here, but I think that Michael and Ptahra and I all do this presentation a lot to kind of illustrate the fact that having a disability really helps us understand our clients, and each of us can kind of see the frustration in those kids' eyes and help their parents understand their disabilities as well. So having said that, let's get into ADHD from my understanding. Next slide, please. Okay, what is ADHD? ADHD is a neurobiological disorder that affects the prefrontal cortex of the brain. It's the portion of the brain that regulates executive functioning. Okay, there are three types essentially: hyperactive ADHD, inattentive ADHD, and a combined type. My personal unscientific theory is I don't believe that there is any such thing as inattentive ADHD. In my opinion, inattentive ADHD is ADHD where the hyperactivity is not outward. So, you know, the typical stereotype of a kid bouncing off the walls in a classroom and can't sit still does fit the profile of traditionally what we thought about ADHD. However, there is a lot of what I refer to as cognitive hyperactivity. A lot of the hyperactivity goes on up in here, and I'll show you some visualizations of that. It's also a disability that impacts the neurotransmitter system. There are essentially three main chemicals: dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine, which is essentially adrenaline. And those systems carry certain chemicals to your brain and really kind of complete your nervous system. And when it's not operating correctly, that is where things break down. If you go to the next slide, this is just a quick visualization. I often think about the thoughts that swirl around my head, as if you've ever seen one of those National Geographic shows, the swarm of fish or birds. There's no real rhyme or reason. And every once in a while, if you have a child or a student that says something completely random, all about word association, something will trigger something that'll pop out of that swarm, and it'll sound like it's from left field, but trust me, there's a reason for it. My wife and I actually play a game where she'll say, "Where did that come from?" And I'll have to retrace the steps of my thought process to get her there. You can go to the next slide. Okay, executive functioning, and that's a big buzzword these days. The prefrontal cortex that controls executive functioning. What is executive functioning? It's the portion of your brain that acts to a certain degree like the conductor of a symphony, the person in charge that manages everything. They deal with organization, prioritization, time perception. A lot of people say time management. I think that's a mistake. It's not just the inability to manage time. People with ADHD or an executive functioning impairment can't really manage anything. Okay, time is a perception issue in addition to an inability to manage it. If there's a lot of that cognitive hyperactivity going on in your head, there's a huge disconnect between thoughts that whiz around in your head at the speed of light versus the very slow reality of life. And so kids have difficulty understanding how long a task is going to take to do. They often think they have more time to complete something. And a lot of times they won't move unless there's an emergency. That's why they always wait till the last minute to do something. Impulse control and hyperactivity, in my opinion, are more of the behavioral culprits that I see in my clients. I do a lot of discipline work, and that comes up quite a bit. These kids know the difference between right and wrong. They just have an inability or a significant difficulty in controlling the impulse to do what seems like a good idea, but most often is not. The other thing I wanted to mention among these other symptoms are the attention regulation. Having attention deficit disorder does not mean you can't pay attention. It means you can't regulate your attention. There's often two extremes. There is either no attention or extreme hyper focus. There's no baseline or midline that most people have. And either a child can't pay attention or they're easily distracted, or once they lock in on something, there's a hyper focus that pretty much excludes the rest of the world. My own personal example is that there are times where I haven't done much all day because I've been easily distracted. And, late in the evening, I will hit this hyper focus and, not get home till 10 or 11 o'clock at night because I feel like I have to ride it out because it's harder to access regularly. You can go to the next slide. This is just a graph to show the difference between executive functioning impairment versus ADHD. You can have at the outer portion of the circle, you can have mild executive functioning impairment, which might impair your ability to organize yourself, but it's not quite ADHD. Moving into the center of the circle, you could have, more pronounced executive functioning impairment, or you can have executive functioning impairment that is so severe that it's diagnosable ADHD. It's really the difference between the level of impairment and the chronic nature of it. So if you reverse it, someone with executive functioning impairment may not have ADHD, but if you have ADHD, you definitely have a executive functioning impairment. You can go to the next slide. Okay, you can flip these as I start talking about them. When we were all younger, we learned that if you place your hand on the hot stove, you will get a sensation that it's hot. A signal will go up to your brain and say it's hot to move your hand. So we all have this visualization. It's like when you plug a cord into the wall, the light goes on. The electricity goes along the wire. But that's not how it works in the human body, okay? The central nervous system is very different. You can go to the next slide. The central nervous system is not made up of a continuous wire like an electrical cord. It is a series of disconnected wires, and those disconnections are bridged by these neurotransmitters that kind of jump from one end to the other. And there has to be a significant amount of chemicals to make that bridge. And there has to be a specific receptor on the other side. And if there is not, what happens is there's a breakdown in the system. I often found that as a kid, there was a certain paralysis. If there was not an emergency, I was not able to move forward. I never did homework. It was very difficult for me to do the work that the other kids were doing unless I created some type of an emergency or an urgency. You can go to the next slide. And the other visualization, this is similar to the fish that I showed before. If you picture a place like New York City, which is the center of culture and commerce and business and everything in the world. But instead of having a whole lot of or multiple international airports, there was just one poorly run landing strip. You get these planes coming in from all over the place, but there's no place to land. So what the airport does is they stack them up in these holding patterns above the airport because they can't land all of these planes. But if one of those planes, if you think about it, had an emergency on it, medical issue, a mechanical issue, there would get instant clearance to land because it's an emergency. And that is a way to kind of explain to parents and to teachers why kids with ADHD will often create these crisis situations because it's a means of forced prioritization. We literally live our lives jumping from putting out this fire to putting out that fire, and it's a way to move forward. You can go to the next slide. This is very important. I think that most people are afraid to get a child diagnosed or to seek services at school because they believe that ADHD or autism spectrum disorder or a learning disability are things that would negatively reflect on their child's intelligence. And it's important to understand that these disabilities are not intelligence deficits, they are performance deficits. So most of my clients with ADHD typically are smart kids, and they often will say the same things at various milestones. It's not that the work is harder. There's so many more things I have to remember. These kids can't get out of their own way. They have to remember to organize their papers. They have to remember to bring their lunch every day, to bring the right textbook to class, bring the right notebook. And the image at the lower portion of the circle there is, as they get older, their assignments are timed assignments. You have 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks to do this type of term paper. And that lack of structure is really where a lot of us have problems. And so it's really important that you identify and you acknowledge and you reinforce to your children or your students that having a disability does not necessarily mean they have a problem with their intelligence. It's the way they perform and it's the way they process information. And there are ways to work around that. We just have to figure out what they are. And that's essentially what Michael and Ptahra and I do for a living, is help schools and parents create specialized learning programs to kind of target a child's individualized learning needs. You can go to the next slide. This is my final slide. It's just, I think if you think about it, this is a quote from Albert Einstein, who I believed had a learning disability. And his quote is, "Everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it'll live its whole life believing that it's stupid." And these kids get an awful lot of negative feedback at school and at home and among their friends. And so keeping that perspective and understanding that these kids are really like little gold mines. And you have to, sometimes it's harder to find that vein of gold, but it's worth looking for because it's there. That's all I have to say. And I wanted to turn it over to Ptahra.
Thank you, Robert. Good evening, everyone. I'm Ptahra Jeppe. I hail from Brooklyn, New York. I'm currently with the Goodwin Oquindo law firm. We do everything from special education to standardized testing and beyond: college, medical school, law school, etc. And so I have the honor and privilege to really see my community up close and personal every day, but the growth and evolution of our lived experience. And like Robert said, finding ways in which we are to navigate the world with the learning disabilities we have. So I'm extremely dyslexic. It is what motivated me to go to law school with the sole focus of doing this work. So I'm going to talk a little bit about dyslexia and the takeaways for me and how it impacts what I do on a daily. So next slide, please. I don't want to get too technical, but I do think it's important to ground us, right? Oftentimes, dyslexia is an invisible disability, and and we use a lot of beautiful, colorful words, especially when we're talking about kiddos. And I totally get that, right? It's a learning challenge. We're gonna crack the code, right? All of these things, and for me, sometimes it's helpful to just ground in this idea that there's something going on behind the eyes, right? There is a neurobiological thing happening. And so the definition adopted by the International Dyslexia Association in 2002 is that dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin. It is characterized by difficulty with accurate and or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. These difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language that is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provisions of effective classroom instruction. So I again, it's taking a step back, and the foundation of it is, I think, to me, one of the greatest takeaways is that it, again, as Robert said, has nothing to do, there is no correlation with intelligence, right? Often those who are dyslexic have average to above average IQ. It is not connected to one's socioeconomic status, right? Or race or language, right? If you're dyslexic in one language, you're dyslexic in another language, right? It is the relation to the sound, word, letter, and the other pillars that that make up reading. I won't go into that too much. Let's move on to the next slide. So how does that work? I'm not going to get into the weeds from a medical point of view, but I am often intrigued by just seeing it, right? And the studies that show the parts of the brain that lights up for typical readers and dyslexic readers. And again, it goes back to this being a neurological disability and not just one of effort or lack thereof, right? So we know that for typical readers, their left hemisphere lights up when reading, which is responsible for the processing of language tasks. It's often associated with speed and accuracy. And for those with dyslexia, that part of the brain is underdeveloped when doing those tasks, right? And so that is there's less robust activation there, right? It's the visual word form part of our brain. And so that means that it's more effortful. It's you can often see letter by letter decoding. And it affects reading comprehension, spelling, writing, encoding, and math. It is one of the reasons why I started out by reading the definition of dyslexia, because even though I put the slide together, even though I'm 35 years old, I've attended almost every educational environment, I've had every intervention you can think of, short of standing on your head, I like to say, I still struggle through that passage. And I think it's important for people to understand that dyslexia is not something you outgrow, right? It's something you can navigate with. Everybody has their own relationship with it. I often steal from Michael, right? The more I do these presentations, the more I realize we don't often look at dyslexia as a spectrum disorder, but it most definitely is, right? And so for someone like me who's extremely dyslexic, it is still effortful. It is still, it takes a lot of labor. And so let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit about then what are takeaways. So first and foremost, it's not a one size fits all, because it is a spectrum. And so oftentimes parents will say to me, well, what should my child do? Right. And that's a loaded question, right? Because we're talking about helping a child become an adult who navigates the world. As we were talking earlier before we began, and one of the things I said, I love doing these presentations because oftentimes we're talking about these disabilities and these learning challenges in a vacuum, right? Like we're talking about children or kiddos, or, what do you do with your students? And not that we grow up to be people and adults and we have seats at the table, right? So it's a spectrum that we are learning to navigate the world with, right? So what does that mean? It means that I'm dyslexic 24 hours a day. I know that is duh, right? Like that's common sense. But I think that's really important because oftentimes I'm working with families and schools, and someone will say to me, well, so and so, I mean, she's just not trying, and every time we get up for reading or math, they're using the bathroom, whatever the case may be. And I often have to stop and say, wait a minute, can you imagine doing something that your brain is not wired to do 24/7? From the time I wake up in the morning, I brush my teeth with toothpaste I cannot spell, right? I'm navigating street signs, I'm driving, I'm doing all of these things. I'm taking in the written worlds every minute of every day while I'm up. And so I think it's important for us to have that context when we talk about our students and our children, because like Robert said, this is not about intelligence, but I take it a step further, right? The child who's showing up every day to school, who's participating, who has push in and pull out and after school and summer camp and summer program, we're asking a lot, right? And so I encourage us to keep that in mind. I think that's for me one of the biggest takeaways that I have from my lived experience and from my clients. And then also, this overlaps with many disabilities, but what does that toolbox look like? For me, it's a trifecta. It's the holy grail of multisensory instruction, grounded in the science of reading, lots of assistive technology as early as possible, and accommodations. It's a combination that I use to this day. It ebbs and flows. I've had parents who have said, "Oh, my child doesn't like speech to text." Fine, that's okay, right? Expose it to them. I've had those same parents come back and say, well, now we're a senior and now we're transitioning. My kid came up to me and said, Ma, I think I want to try that again, right? Because I often tell people that we are not stagnant, right? I am learning myself and my learning disability as I progress in the world, right? Like I didn't know what it was going to be like to go to high school or undergrad or law school or be an attorney with dyslexia until I did those things, right? And so we're growing and using the muscles, but the foundation piece, right? The idea that you will have a toolbox that may grow with you over time, is something that I encourage all families and educators to really explore, especially when it comes to dyslexia. Um, because again, it's not something that you outgrow or overcome, right? It's more about learning to navigate the world. So those are my takeaways when it comes to dyslexia, and my connection with it. I'm going to turn it back over for Q&A.
Thanks, everybody. You guys are always fabulous. I have first question for Ptahra. Can you please speak about individuals who don't have early intervention?
Well, I mean, the short answer to that is early intervention is the key, right? We know that the earlier we can begin to have interventions and remediation, the growth is incredible, right? And I at least here in New York, I think it's important to point out that it's twofold. One, as we advocate for the science and reading as a tier 1 support, right? So it's the teaching how to read from the beginning, using these methodologies rooted in the science of reading to every child as soon as possible, right? Because we know that good teaching is good teaching, right? And so it's not just for the students who have dyslexia, but then for the students that need that tier 2 and tier 3 support, it is crucial that we're making sure that happens as soon as possible, right? I am as Michael pointed out, I'm, a early 90s baby where it was wait 3 years, right? Let's see that deficit grow. And we know that is incorrect now, right? It's more than RTI. And so it's making sure that we have both tier 1 instruction, but also having deeper remediation and being able to identify students, whether that's a universal screener or other states who may flag students and then go into deeper testing. So I'll stop there because, of course, I can talk about that forever.
There was a question from Michael about masking. Michael,
More specifically, what about masking?
I think that she just wanted you to speak a little bit about how that impacts kids and
Sure.
getting through the day.
So a lot of autistic people, and I've done it, mask. They appear what we call normal, and it varies from person to person. I've had people say to me, "You don't look autistic," whatever that means, or "You appear normal." And it varies from person to person, but masking is trying to appear normal, and for some people it's not that hard. I don't usually have a hard time with it, but for some autistics it takes tremendous mental energy that can exhaust the hell out of them, and because of that, excuse me, that mental exhaustion can lead to other things later, like meltdowns or d deterioration, because they go through 8, 9 hours masking and then they just need to unwind and let go. The truth is, I always say there are rules we all have to follow in society just for living in society, but you shouldn't hide who you are.
I think that
That,
happens. I think a lot of us have seen that with our kids, that no matter what their issues are, they go through the day holding it together. It takes so much for them to hold it together, whether it's autism spectrum or dyslexia or ADD, and all of a sudden they get home and they just collapse because
and what I find is the schools tend to say, well, that's not our problem, that they're holding it together in the school day and they're collapsing at home. It's not happening in school, but it's happening as a result of school.
Also, it becomes a bigger problem when they get older too, because when kids go away to college, what'll happen is once they get away from their parents and they get away from their regular school environment, they don't want to feel that burden of their disability anymore. And there will be a lot of masking in the sense of, I just want to fit in where I'm going, wherever I'm going. And without the supports that they need, they typically will crash and burn in an unstructured environment. It happens quite a bit, and it's really very difficult. And it's interesting, but kids with a number of disabilities are unique. They have extremely amazing talents. There are certain things they don't do very well. So, but it's just really difficult because there's this, I guess, societal norm of what people are supposed to be like. And when you try to fit into it and it becomes more difficult, it could add to a lot of the pressure they're facing anyway. So just wanted to throw that out there.
And I would
Well, and I think college is an interesting point. Sorry, Robert, you're making about college, because college is all about conformity. People want to join fraternities and sororities. Nothing screams conformity like fraternities and sororities. Sorry,
well,
Ptahra, you were.
no, I was gonna just add that connecting the college piece to, well, what do we do now when they're a little younger? I noticed that the transition is also made difficult by a lack of understanding about their own disabilities, right? Like, you obviously know that maybe I don't learn the same way or I don't read the same way, right? But how many of my friends even could not articulate how it was that they learned or what does that mean? And so how do I even enter into a space? I often say it sounds a lot different if you hire me and I say, yeah, so I can't read, right? Then if I go into a space and say, so I'm dyslexic, so that means that I need speech to text and text to speech, and this, right? Like, I know what I need, boom, bang, bang, right? I've had um, uh, uh, supervisors who said to me, "Oh, okay, sure." Right. And I think when you're trying to navigate space and find out who you are at the same time, just in terms of the regular transitions, that becomes really difficult. And I think for us, it starts really early. There's so many of my clients that I'll often say, "Oh, regardless of their disability, right? Oh, you use this software." And they look at me like I have 9 heads, right? Like, huh? You're an adult. What do you mean? Right? Like, there's a secrecy, right? You may be at home where your parent says you're smart, right? But what does that mean? What does that mean? What does that look like? Or for many of my students who um, are being unofficially or not formally accommodated in school, and then they make that transition to college, and so they didn't even realize, to Robert's point, that there may have been safeguards or right things that help them with time management or being able to come after school. And so it's really important that we think about our kiddos long term, right? That's, getting all the services while they're in school, making sure that it's documented so that when they get to college, they can even advocate for these things that they had been getting all the way through, and that they have the language and are empowered to even do that, whatever that looks like for them, right? Some people are going to be loud and proud like me, and others may do a whole lot of masking, but at the end of the day, can I make that transition? Can I reach out to somebody and know what I even need, what I need to ask for? That I think that goes a long way as young people begin to develop and come into their own.
As I said, I think that there is that level of, parents who think that I've had parents who call me and say, my child doesn't have a disability, he's smart. They don't understand disability doesn't mean that they're not smart.
Michael, I think you said you were diagnosed at 18 is the question. What was your experience in school before, without the diagnosis?
To put it bluntly, it sucks. I was put in special ed in programs that were not appropriate with kids and then special schools that were not appropriate. As my mother tells the story, when I graduated high school, the principal had something nice to say about everybody but me. And so they put me in these environments that were just not appropriate. A lot of the kids were kids there who were getting arrested, which is not really my thing. So, I don't generally break the law other than a traffic ticket. So there was a lot of those, which I thought was weird. It was just they didn't know what to do with me. As I tell the story, the social worker in sixth grade told my mother, "Throw your son away. He'll never graduate college." But they said that about they said the one friend I had was ready to go back to public school, and the day before his 16th birthday, he committed suicide in part because of that social worker. So what I learned is the experts are not always the experts. People who are supposed to be the experts don't always know the right thing.
Robert, you mentioned the challenge of masking in college. Do you have advice for support in college and what to look for?
I do. I have two things that I think are crucial to avoid that situation. One is that the most important thing a parent can do is to make their child feel comfortable with who they are. I think that too many parents traditionally are protecting their child from the disability words and are concerned about what's the word I'm looking for, labeling. And what that does, unfortunately, it perpetuates those
Stigma?
that stigma. Thank you very much. And so what happens is that when those kids get away from their parents and they're required to self-report their disability, request services when they get to college or in the working world, wherever, they are reluctant to report because they have been taught or felt that their disability was something to be ashamed of. But more practically speaking, they are not in a position to articulate their needs and ask for services, and they're required to. The law changes, so when you graduate from high school and go into post-secondary, you have to self-identify, you have to provide documentation, and you have to request reasonable accommodations. And you really have to instill the importance of self-advocacy in your children when they get older. And that should start at a very young age. And also, I find that it also is quite empowering for them if you sit down with them and say, what frustrates you about school? What makes you angry? What don't you like about school? And they know that you are using that information to make it a better place. It's quite empowering for them. They're not sitting by as you advocate for them. They're driving the process. Those are things I think parents can do. Another thing that's a very good bridge from high school to post-secondary is the availability of various types of coaches. There are coaches that specialize in executive functioning, even with ADHD. And as a parent who's not there with your child or at the adolescent age, the structure that you're trying to provide may be something they're pushing back against. Having someone that is their person that they can access as they need, that can really work with them is crucial. I used to run a nonprofit that provided ADHD coaching for students all over the country. And it was tremendously empowering for kids going into that unstructured environment where all of the things they hated about being at home or in high school were really the things that they needed. And so I think those are things to look into, coaching, and certainly, absolutely, getting your child to understand their disability, know it's nothing to be ashamed of, asking for what they need, participating actively in the special education process are very important.
And I would just add to that, the preparation for college and disability should not happen when your child steps foot on that campus, right? When the preparation for that is starting 2 years before, right? To be honest, right? It's the nuts and bolts, and I won't go into that, right? But making sure that your documentation is updated and all of that. But even when you're going on college tours, right? Understanding the difference between a disability program and a disability center, understanding what supports are on campus, going to look at them, right? That being part of your college tour. It is not this afterthought that when you show up on the first day, your child is kind of left to figure out how they do all the things that Robert said. In fact, I would dare to say at that point, we're late in the game, right? Especially as we transition. That first day of class, you have to, hit the ground running. And so that's not the time where your child, or a few days before, a couple of weeks before, right, hears from someone from a disability support center, right? As a family, when you guys start talking about transition after high school, that's part of the conversation. Make sure when you're going on college tours that you're stopping at the disability office, the learning center, whatever it's called on that campus, that you're asking questions, that your child is asking questions, modeling what Robert is talking about, right? What is it that you need so that you can be there to support, making sure that FERPA forms are filled out if they need a little bit more support. And that person, to Robert's point, doesn't necessarily need to be parent or guardian. It could also be coach, right? And so I have some clients for whom their learning specialist is their person for supportive decision making, right? And so they have asked that they sit in on certain meetings and help advocate for certain things, right? So that the plan is kind of in place, right? It doesn't mean that your child is not going to go through all life stages, right? College is going to bring a whirlwind in of itself, but that kind of preparation for, okay, how do they not burn out or fail out or whatever the case may happen that we often see, that preparation happens way before kiddo gets there. So I'd encourage families to begin to think about that in 10th grade. And I think the last thing I'll say on it is when we think about the early preparations, and I know that Michael and Robert and I have said this in other spaces, but beginning to think about pulling your kiddo in on an IEP meeting or a 504 meeting, right? Even when they're really young. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be there the whole time, right? It doesn't work for every kid. There is no magical age. It may look different, but this idea that we should be prepping and preparing, right? College is not this place you go off to. So it's building those skills along the way, to Robert's point, so that they're actively engaged in an IEP meeting to understand what their accommodations are, right? How many clients do I know, or even friends of mine who said, yeah, I had one friend who said, I go to this room to take my tests because they like me and they're nice and they don't want me to look stupid in front of everybody else. And she had a IEP her whole life, right? Not engaging in the process early on is a harder thing to adjust to when you're, as Robert said, when the laws change, right? And you're expected to, the responsibilities begin to shift as to what you need to say and how you need to say it and proof and all of these things. We can start early, right? Just building that skill, building that muscle, building that comfort. Even if they don't share it with the world, they begin to understand language and what they need for later on ahead.
I want to just say something about prior webinars and presentations that we've had. about these things that you guys have just been speaking about. So Robert has done an amazing presentation about stigma and having kids able to understand their disabilities and what they need, and also preparing for college for kids with disabilities. Both Ptahra and Robert have done presentations, and we have those videos on our website, and I'm happy to send them out to anyone who asks. Also, in December, we're having a presentation about what executive functions kids need before they graduate from high school. And that's also something that sort of ties into what you guys were saying. Robert, what can schools do to train, teach, or assist school-age kids, little kids, K-5, diagnosed with ASD or ADHD with executive functioning?
Well, there's a lot they can do that they currently don't do. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is that when I was a kid, I didn't like to write, and I would never take notes, and I never understood what was the important thing to write down. And they teach so much about the substantive material, the math, the science, whatever it is. They don't really talk to kids about how to take notes, about how to organize themselves, about how to see the bigger picture, and where one of the things people with ADHD a lot of times will be taught to make lists of things so they don't forget what they have to do. And I find it much more effective to think in terms of outlines as opposed to making a list in and of itself, because the outline also tells me what the relationship is between the various things and kind of where they fit in together. And it's something that most people think about as not that big of a deal, but for some kids, it's really challenging. Or to learn about how to kind of schedule themselves to do a book report that's due in 4 weeks. Come back next week and you'll pick a topic. Come back next week and we will talk about how you're going to approach your sources or whatever it is. And so I think those types of skills, organization, note taking, are really an effort in developing coping mechanisms that most of us develop the hard way by failing, can be really taught and nurtured at a young age, say at the elementary school level, before they start getting into difficulty in middle school. Those are just some examples.
One for Michael. Can you explain the differences in the organizations ASAN, ASD, and ASA?
I think the main Autism Speaks ASD is the Autism
Yeah.
Spectrum Disorder. So Autism Speaks was founded years ago by some very rich people whose granddaughter, who were executives at NBC, whose grandson had autism. A lot of self-advocates don't like them because they've looked for a cure, which doesn't exist, and they've put a lot of money into other things except what's really necessary, and they've made some incendiary remarks in terms of autism. What ASAN is what I would call the radicals. They're the people who are going to get themselves arrested and protest, and sometimes their tactics are right, sometimes their tactics are wrong. Autism Speaks is more the Autism Society is more the mainstream in the middle. It's a mix of self-advocates, professionals, and family members, whereas ASAN is all self-advocates. Autism Speaks is largely family members, and so that's kind of the difference. Whereas I find the Autism Society bridges that gap and brings all the groups together.
We have some questions about the best way to support adults who are diagnosed but have never received services and were just pushed through school.
That's I mean, I assume you mean autism.
Yeah, there is autism and also dyslexia.
I think it's tricky. I think it's hard once you're an adult. It's a lot easier to teach children how to modify things than adults. I think part of it is we're not where we're at on servicing adults who've got newly diagnosed and didn't learn those skills. And I'm not really sure what the answer is, except that we need more services, which right now is not really something that's going to happen.
I would say more services. I'd also say, Robert brought it up before, but it's never too late to meet with a learning specialist, to meet with someone who is Oren Gillingham trained, to meet with an executive functioning coach, right? To do some of the back and leg work that we're often advocating for our youngsters to get when they're a little younger. Um, right? That first and foremost, also finding community, whatever that means for you, whether it's connecting with a dyslexia organization or a community. I think is helpful to because some of this is the technical stuff, and some of it I would say having friends and colleagues in this space. I learned from others, right? I've learned from friends and colleagues who are blind, right? They too have difficulty navigating the written word. And so, unfortunately, word of mouth is very powerful, right? Community is very powerful. Understanding, sometimes I'm nodding at Robert because my husband, who has ADHD and executive functioning, when he gives his examples about his wife, I'm laughing and chuckling to myself because I say, is that why he does that? Or I say the same thing, right? So it's, and having friends now who are getting married, and I have to pull them aside, the husbands, et cetera, and say, hey, look, this she had, right? And so it's finding community, but also finding professionals in the field, because it's never too late, right? Whether it's connecting with somebody like AT Help, Mark Sarabian, who does a really good job about working with individuals of all ages to work on assistive technology, or great executive functioning coaches I know, and learning specialists, because for all of us, it's never too late. But those would be my recommendations.
Thank
So I
you.
want to answer what Tara said, about finding community. One thing I've always mentioned, emphasizes, just remember, your community doesn't have to be people with the same disability. I have a lot of friends with all different disabilities, like Ptahra and Robert. There are some autistic people I can't stand. And I think that the other part about finding community is, I think what's an interesting dynamic is when you have your one disability that interacts with another disability. And I love this story because it's so illustrative. We were at COPA, which I'll mention in a minute, which is our National Organization of Special Ed Attorneys. And Ptahra was trying to ask a question of a woman who was a deaf-blind attorney, very noted. And the way you ask the question is you have to type on a little keyboard. And Ptahra's like, well, what am I supposed to do? I'm dyslexic. And I thought it was a great example of how do you accommodate both of them. And I see her laughing as I tell the story. If
You ask somebody who can, right? So
I
I
think
feel
I
you.
offered to type for you.
Yes, exactly. And again, that's us showing up in space, right? Having a seat at the table, right? Navigating the world as adults. We're here.
Ptahra, how young were you when you knew you wanted to become an attorney, with so much reading required? And how did your teachers help you? And how did you find the tools to achieve everything you've done?
Whoa, that's a loaded
Everything,
question.
everything you've done.
Yeah. So I am very fortunate, right? I have had amazing educators and amazing parents. That didn't mean that from preschool to about seventh grade, I transferred schools almost every year, right? They didn't necessarily know what to do with me, but they were very supportive. And I say that because my mom likes to remind me that I came home in third grade, even though I cried every day because I was like, oh, this is torture, I was great at rug time. And after that, I was like, I came home and I said, Mom, I may not know how to read, but I'm one of the smartest kids in my class. And I think that really stemmed from being supported, being told that I had these gifts and I could be creative. And, they listened and the teachers highlighted the strengths I did have. And so I was always very bold. I came home in the sixth grade and I was appointed editor-in-chief of the school newspaper, which my mom almost fell out because she was like, I love you, I would support you. And then she, under her breath, said, how are you going to do that, honey? And I said, well, it's way more than reading and writing. You can get someone for that, right? But I say that again, it was the mindset, right? It was a combination of that and seeing my parents advocate for me, because I was encouraged and I had this loud, boisterous kind of personality. I remember having friends, like I mentioned earlier, a friend who told me her senior year about to graduate that she, took exams in another space because they liked her and they knew that she was dumb, and they were helping out so that she wouldn't be embarrassed. And I said, ha, think so. That sounds like sets to me. Or back then, that sounds like resource room. And so I showed up at her parent teacher conference and I said, I know that so-and-so must have an IEP. What
Was
a
this one the one when you were 16 years old?
Yes, it was, Michael. And so I think there's a combination of all of those things that led me to know that I wanted to do something to help people. And I'll be honest, I think it was one step led to another step that led to another, right? Being denied my right to take LSAT with accommodations and all of these things that kind of shaped where I ended up, right? How did I navigate it? I use a lot of assistive technology. I use a lot of accommodations. I had a learning specialist in undergrad and law school. I chose a university that had a learning disability program, which would provide more supports for me. And it hasn't always been rosy. I think there's, as we talked about here, it's tough. Right. I live this 24 hours a day. It's not always rainbows and butterflies. There's been a lot of emotional ups and downs. Um, but I think by the time I got I was graduating undergrad, I had this idea that I was going to go to law school. I had no idea what that was going to look like. I didn't know other dyslexic attorneys. And when I met them, I had all these stories of like, oh, I found out I was dyslexic when my child got diagnosed. And though that's very cute, I was like, oh, that's not me, right? Like I have to have someone read. And it was also just building on these skills. I know I keep jumping back between higher ed and K-12, but the skills that I learned, in fifth grade, I started reading books on tape. Never in a million years did I think that I would take the bar exam, right? Which for me, with double time, a reader, a scribe, a separate location, extra breaks, would be 8 hours a day for 4 consecutive days. So when you're thinking about a little Robert, a little Ptahra, a little Michael, and you're like, oh, it's double time. Oh, we don't need to put that on the IEP. They could just come after lunch. It's 10-minute
That's
exam.
funny.
Right? Like I built that muscle over time, right? I don't really have an answer as to how I got here, or I didn't have it then and I don't have it now, but when I look back at it, it was a series of building blocks that kind of prepared me for the storm that was being, a dyslexic undergrad and law student and now attorney. So that's kind of
It's
how
funny
I got
Ptahra mentioned that though, because like this is how every disability is different. I didn't need extra time. I worked very quickly, and extra time was usually something that was a burden for me.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's hard. That's the other thing. These skills are hard. I think we underestimate them, right? And we have all these beautiful terms for them. Like it'll help level the playing field. And in my mind, I already know that is not someone who actually has a learning disability that came up with that phrase, because it does not level the playing field. It allows me to play, right? Taking into account that, I read now at about 500 and something words per minute, or I listen, right, at about 500 and something words per minute. That's how I read. But it's a skill, and I had to build that muscle over time. So again, when we talk about, well, how do we succeed in college and how do we succeed in life? It's not the mad rush in junior year to oh, let's see what assistive tech is out there, or let's see what transition program. That this is really a building block that happens over time. It's most definitely never too late, but we are building skills that hopefully help us navigate the rest of our lives, right? Even if we don't know what that's going to look like yet.
It's
Thank
true
you.
that nobody disabled or not can really plan out their whole life at 21, 22 years old. I'm 47 and I'm still trying to figure it out.
I love that you built your muscle over time. I haven't heard you say that before. That's terrific. Thank you, guys. You are truly inspiring. And oh, whoop, hold on one second.
Oh, I have to do a plug for COPA before we go.
Okay, you can do that, and that was just another thank you. Okay.
Oh, so just so you all know, there is a national organization of special ed attorneys. Ptahra, Robert, and I are all members. Eve's a member too. I'm on the national board. It's COPA, COPAA.org, and they are the National Professional Organization of Attorneys and Advocates in Special Ed, representing families, and they're doing a big membership drive right now as we speak.
And when is it coming up?
What is what coming up? Oh, the
The COPA
conference?
conference?
It'll be as usual in March, and it's going to be in the DC area this year, in Crystal City, Virginia, just outside of DC. So this could be an exciting one.
Okay. Anybody else on that or anything else? Okay, so the slides and materials are going to be posted on our website. Everybody will get a copy of the video along with the slides, and any questions, feel free to send them to us, info@spednet.org, and I can send them out to Michael, Ptahra, or Robert. And thank you guys. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you,
Thank you for
Thank you
having
for
us.
having us.
as always.